Hello and welcome into another episode of the Northwestern Roundtable Podcast. My name is Gavin Dorsey, your host as always, joined here by Ryan Cole, another writer for Northwestern Roundtable. It's a critical week coming up for the Wildcats, now 5-5 on a 3-game skid. Had that really just last-second gutting loss to Michigan last week. Now we'll have the upcoming game at Wrigley Field, their final game at Wrigley Field this season, maybe for a while, with the new stadium coming out against Minnesota on Saturday. But Ryan, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Gavin. Thanks for having me on. During this, what you've already outlined is a very critical week on this losing skid. This feels like, the one that they probably really need if they're going to get the bowl game. So happy to be on to discuss it.
Certainly. We were looking at, when that 6th win was going to come, Northwestern having one of the most difficult strengths of schedules in the entire nation. Obviously, we've kind of seen that manifest against Nebraska, pre-Dylan Raiola injury, USC, who's still fighting for the playoff, Michigan, who's still fighting for the playoff, Minnesota, who is still a scrappy team at 6-4, and Illinois, who started the year ranked as a top 10 team, has been stumbling a little bit, but still a very high-quality opponent. It's definitely fighting for a higher echelon bowl game. But, kind of looking back to that Michigan game last week, Northwestern rallies from a 12-point deficit in the fourth quarter, takes the lead with about 12 minutes to go, can't get a single first down after that, is able to force 5 turnovers on Michigan, but just can't quite come away with the win. The Wolverines and Dominic Zavada, the Michigan's kicker, ends up making a 31-yarder to win the game 24-22. Ryan, I know you were battling a little bit of an illness, so you weren't at the game. So maybe you got to hear some of I was listening to the Westlaw Pirates pod a little bit earlier. They were talking about some disrespect to Northwestern, how they were mostly talking about the Michigan-Ohio State game on the pregame. But, so I hope you're feeling better overall. But, still watching the game in general, what was your takeaway from, just a really devastating, gutting loss for Northwestern?
Well, my takeaway was that it seems that they're really going to struggle in games where they can't run the football, which we kind of already knew, but it was interesting to see them in a spot where they were forced to do some different things on offense. They put up 61 yards rushing. That's not really like them. Obviously, Michigan has a very good run defense, and that's probably why it's kind of unlike anything they'd seen previously. But they really stayed in this game, obviously, because they forced 5 turnovers. If it wasn't for that, I think their inability to run the football would have turned this into a much larger margin. Stone was 13 for 27, not great. They only got 2 balls to Wildy. I think he had like 51 yards receiving. If they're going to be forced to throw, that they're going to have to use him more because, as we've discussed for a long time this season, they don't have the depth at the receiver position. But I think the good news is Minnesota isn't as good of a rush defense, and hopefully they can get back to their game next week. But I think, not having, Komalafe running people over and the offensive line pushing the way that it has all season, I think they really had to kind of adjust on the fly. And I commend them for staying competitive, but if not for the turnovers, I think it could have been worse. And I think, just kind of reinforced expectations for this team in terms of, what it takes for them to win. So going to need some improvement in the rushing attack against Minnesota, or we might see something similar.
Yeah, definitely. I remember having this conversation with Michigan Roundtable publisher Brandon Brown last week, and we were just kind of talking about, the spread, I think, was 13.5 at that point in time. And we were like, both of these teams just play ugly ground and pound football. And even though Northwestern really wasn't able to run the ball at all the entire game, it was still pretty much a very similar game than what we had expected. This obviously ends up going down to literally the buzzer with Zavada kicking the game-winning field goal. Michigan actually did open it up for one of the first times this season. Freshman quarterback Bryce Underwood ended up leading, throwing for a career high in passing yards as a total offense. They, I think, had 496 total yards, and like you mentioned, it was just really just those turnovers that kept Northwestern in this game. And by all accounts, as far as, Northwestern certainly got outplayed during this game. Absolutely. And you could argue maybe Michigan playing with their food a little bit. Those are the kind of games that Northwestern wins, though. Those are the kind of games that Northwestern's able to scrap out, against Penn State and, even, UCLA, not a great team at the time, but they were kind of pulling out of it. They ended up just beating, Penn State the week after, or maybe it was the week before. Whatever the case was, or they ended up beating Penn State the week after playing Northwestern. But like overall, just by all accounts, even though Northwestern was outplayed, still felt like a game the Wildcats could have won. And I think that's probably the most frustrating part about this is that it was right there, and you could see, we've seen how David Braun has coached in these clutch, high pressure moments throughout his career, and the results have been great. He's come down to, I believe, one of the winningest records in the Big Ten in the country in those close games. But over this last 3-game losing streak, that close loss to Nebraska, ended up being a pretty big margin against USC, but you could argue the first half was really close. Things were almost different. If, that fumble return touchdown ends up putting Northwestern up 7 instead of down 7 at halftime. Just overall, I don't know. What did you see from this game in how Northwestern handles those late game situations? And I know there's been a lot of criticism about, Braun's coaching and decision making and play calling. Where are you kind of standing on that after 10 weeks of year 3?
I think it's still a tough judgment, right? Because I think when you get in those late game scenarios, and obviously, the Cats needed to convert some first downs in the fourth quarter, and they didn't. And some of that absolutely should fall on the coaching. Ultimately, there's been too much of that this season where late in games, they just don't seem to have anything in the tank, or they don't know what to do. And, leads to a lot of 3-and-outs. And then they're giving the other team lots of shots against the defense, which has played well all year and was fantastic against Michigan. I'd like to, plug them a little bit. They deserve credit for those turnovers. They were flying around. Robert Fitzgerald was everywhere. But I think in those late game scenarios, it's a little hard to fully judge Braun or Lujan or any of those guys because Preston Stone is a vet and he's done some nice things to keep the Wildcats in ball games this season. But I'm still not sure that these coaches have really had a very good quarterback situation late in these games. And what it comes down to sometimes in late game scenarios is, do you have the quarterback who can lead your team down the field? And Stone, sometimes it feels like he doesn't, I question his arm strength a little bit. Sometimes the ball looks a little wobbly, and he hasn't performed particularly well in those spots. And he didn't, this game clearly came down to Stone because they couldn't run the football. And he didn't perform again in the biggest of spots at the end of that game. So, at a certain point where, 2 games left in the season, and it's fair to point some fingers, I think, at the starting quarterback for those struggles. I think that is a fair statement at this point.
Yeah, it is. It is interesting because the games that we've seen Northwestern play with a lead have not gone, super well by all accounts. The ones that Northwestern's had to play from behind, and I guess the Penn State is really just kind of the main instance of this. Things have seemed to click a lot more, and even against USC when they were playing from behind, they still had a pretty solid ground game. But trying to coach with the lead against UCLA ended up letting them get back into it. Purdue, even though they didn't score anything, still so many opportunities to allow Purdue back into that game. Then had a little bit with I'm totally blanking right now, but you see the point with Michigan as well. It was almost like there was too much time, and so with that, we haven't really gotten to see. We saw one attempt where Preston Stone goes and tries to lead him on a game-winning drive against Nebraska. Made a couple bad plays then, but I generally agree. I think overall, they've. I'm not super critical on the decisions that they made regarding leading to this loss. I think some of the ones in the first half, at the end of the first half, and that clock management were a lot worse. I think some of the settling for field goals when they could have gone forward and attempted touchdowns, I wasn't so sure about that. But in general, I wasn't super opposed to David Braun and Zach Lujan's decision making. I think a lot of it came down to just execution. And in the fourth quarter, they have the lead with 12:05 to go, right? And the ball. or they have the lead with 12:05 to go, end up getting it back with, I want to say, 8 minutes to go, something like that. Um, from that point on, Northwestern has two drives. They go three and out both times, combined for -3 yards. You know, I believe both of those times there was a pass on first down, which was either ran out of bounds or was incomplete. Clock stops. I thought there was not great management of the clock overall. And I mean, Hunter Welsing had a great day. He ended up dropping a pretty big pass on third down that, yes, was contested, but absolutely right within his hands. I think it's hard to put blame entirely on one factor, like it was a bad pass or it was a bad coaching decision or it should have been a catch,
Hmm.
because frankly, I thought all of them were alive for this. I think just overall for, someone following Northwestern, an incredibly frustrating loss given the fact that it was right here. Um, yeah, overall, I mean, were there any other good signs that you were thinking of that, maybe weren't as deflating from that game?
Well, I mean, I mentioned it a little bit, during my last answer, but I do think, defensively, I'm not sure I've seen them play with that much fire in a long time. I mean, you know, the the defense is usually pretty solid, and they play their spots well, and keep Northwestern in ball games. But they really looked like they were playing with a different energy level. I mean, I don't know if you noticed that up in the press box, but on TV, it really seemed like they were flying around faster and hitting harder than they normally do. And sometimes that's difficult to kind of parse out when you're watching the game. And sometimes it's really obvious and in your face. And this was an example for me where it was like, wow, like those guys are really playing hard. And, that kind of sounds like an announcerism, I guess, but it really, it was evident on the TV screen this weekend.
Yeah.
So I was really impressed by that. And, obviously it paid off with the five turnovers.
Right. It's interesting, like, it's not often that you see a long snapper force a fumble
Hmm.
on a punt play and then recover the same fumble. Uh,
Hmm.
it's interesting because, we heard from David Braun post game and he was going off, right? He's like, this is not a, oh, well, you tried, you did your best kind of thing. They came here to win. Uh, and it's you see a lot of that on the defensive side. I mean, they were flying around. Robert Fitzgerald has been like a hawk back there. Braden Turner ended up, I believe, with an interception that almost got down into the end zone, and then either a forced fumble or a fumble recovery late as well. You just haven't quite
Hmm.
seen that translate to the offensive end. And granted, that's because you can't just run around and hit people on the offensive side. You can have that ground and pound game, but when you're going up against a team that's as good as Michigan and really keys in on stopping that, it just is difficult. And Braun wants to claim that Northwestern is going to compete with the Ohio States and the Michigans and the Penn States of the Big Ten. Almost had a chance to beat two out of the three of those this year, both of them that he had faced. It's just the little things. And I really felt that in this game, Northwestern did not win in the margins, which is where they need to in a game that is completely dominated by Michigan against a team that, supposedly has all of this much more talent and this much more experience and won the stinking national championship 2 years ago. Um, it's I've kind of struggled with figuring out where to place this team because I feel
Hmm.
like there's always kind of this urge to say, oh, this is a good team or this is a bad team. And I feel like the record is misleading. It's, Northwestern's 5-5. It started at 5-2. They played one of the most difficult schedules in the country. I believe five opponents that are or have been ranked in the top 25 at some point this year in Illinois, Oregon, Tulane, Michigan, and USC. And yet it feels like this almost like scale, like we can either have an incredibly, optimistic day, oh, this is a Northwestern team that can compete with anybody in the Big Ten, or it can completely swing the other way, like, how can you expect to compete in the Big Ten if you don't have a quarterback that can complete 50% of his passes? What's your overall gauge of this? Regardless of whether Northwestern makes it to a bowl game or not, like, how have you felt just in general about the season?
Well, I think kind of zooming out on the program and kind of the scope, I guess, looking into the future. I, I remember I was sitting in the press conference last year after the Illinois loss at Wrigley, And that was the first time I'd ever heard Braun just say, to the media, like, "Hey, we want to compete for Big Ten championships," and he keeps saying it. And I remember back then when I first heard it, I will admit I was kind of like, really? Like, that's the goal. Like, that seems like a lofty goal. It seems like there's a lot of steps on your way to getting there. Um, I will say that I think I'm taking him a little bit more seriously now, not necessarily because of the results, but just because of how much he's stuck to it. And because I do think that this year I've seen them develop an identity, that it, is, I think it's a solid identity to have in the Big Ten, and I think it could lead to success. I think that they are running the ball really well. It seems like they're capable of really churning out good offensive linemen, and they don't necessarily have to recruit at an incredibly high level to get them. I think that, the narrative that Northwestern is good at developing offensive linemen is true, and we're seeing that this year. They've been great in the trenches, and defensively, they're not, 100% consistent all the time, but they have guys on the line, they have guys in the secondary, and they can stop the pass and they can stop the run. I think what we're seeing now, the reason why they're 5-5 is that they have an incomplete offense. They can run the football. They've been very good at that, but they are lacking in weapons, and the quarterback situation has not been ideal. And I just think there's a limit to how much the identity can carry you in today's brand of football when you can't, when you get down in these games. Obviously, they came back in this one, but credit to the turnovers a little bit. But like when you get down in these games, you need to feel like you can come back. You need to feel like you have weapons on the offensive side of the ball that you can use in the passing game. And I feel like really that's what's missing right now. And I think ultimately, as they try to push forward and Braun tries to create this program that he envisions where, they're competing for championships in the Big Ten, they're going to have to figure that out. And it's going to be tough because recruiting is hard, and, it kind of prestige matters and money matters, and who knows how that's going to develop. I will take a minute to shout out Jaden McDuffie, who's a 4-star receiver that just got upgraded to
And
4-star. So that's
0 and
that's pretty
4s
cool.
in
And
the suburbs just went up to 4-star as well. So
yeah,
those are two
yeah.
early
So
recruits that Northwestern has scouted.
So that's pretty cool. I mean, I think that like recruiting, I write a lot about recruiting for our site. I do a lot of those stories, and it does seem to me like it's at least trending in the right direction. It feels like Braun is probably improving because he's only been a head coach for a few seasons now, and he's had to adjust to that whole process of recruiting players, and I think he's probably getting better. I think you know the fact that they've shown they can develop at certain positions probably helps. If you're a 3-star offensive lineman, you should come to Northwestern. We churn them out into solid starters.
Or
And
into
so like
NFL caliber players. I mean,
NFL,
I
right?
fully expect. I mean, Tiernan's probably going to be picked in the draft, but I mean, you
Hmm.
can't tell me that Carcelo and either and probably Carcelo and Berntsen aren't they aren't going to have a look as an undrafted free agent or maybe as a late round pick. Probably
Yeah,
not, but those are still guys that are professional caliber.
yeah. I mean, I would not be shocked at all if we're writing about them in training camps next fall. So like, there's lots of talent there, and so I guess my overall point is, I think my takeaway from this year so far is that you know, I'm willing to take Braun a little more seriously when he says those things because it does feel like he's really trying to build it. It's going to just be a much longer process, and you're going to have to infuse this roster with more weapons because to me, that is like the blatant hole right now. There's probably others that I'm not thinking of. I don't know if you have any thoughts, but that's the one where it feels like they're significantly behind the best teams in the Big Ten. It doesn't seem like they have the pass catchers um, to really compete to me.
Okay. On that note, can I say something crazy?
Yeah.
Because I am inclined to agree with you that I am starting to believe Braun, and I do think we have to see the results first. Obviously, it can't just be coach speak, and he's got a lot
Hmm.
of coach speak. But when I was sitting in that press conference room underneath Wrigley Field, and he's given a spiel about how Northwestern is going to be competing for Big Ten championships. This is just right off of a devastating loss. This isn't him, talking about the game. He's talking about like the program's heart and you know that he just doesn't really feel like good game or good effort is cutting it, the first thing that came to mind, have you seen that speech from Dan Hurley at UConn like a couple years before they win the national championships? And he's saying, you better get us now because we're coming. We have all of the pieces set, and granted, I'm pretty sure they were still like a tournament caliber team then, but
Mhm.
the point still stands. He could kind of see that coming, and it turned from a tournament caliber team into a national contention team. And obviously, not the same. I'm not saying that Northwestern's going to be competing for national championships anytime soon, but the reality is you have 9 Big 10 games. If you can win 3 out of, 3 out of just being able to handle them, 3 out of you know, just strictly being better in the margins and then try and upset 1 or 2, I mean, that's absolutely how you can get to a Big Ten championship. And I feel like Braun, regardless of what you think about his in-game coaching decisions or um, whether you think he has the stuff to be a head coach, I think he's certainly shown that he is willing to take risks to put this program in place to where it needs to be, not just to be good for Northwestern standards, but to be good for Big Ten standards. And as a reminder, this is year 3 in his entire life as a head coach. And he is a Power 5 Big Ten head coach, going toe to toe with Michigan and Penn State. And, last year for almost an entire half, Ohio State, before they obviously, were the national champions and pulled away. But it gave me similar vibes, honestly. And I am inclined, at least for now, to trust David Braun at his word. This is just the first year with Mark Jackson. They're bringing in a almost $1 billion football stadium next year. We just saw
Mhm.
the biggest transfer portal recruiting class in history this year. Freshman recruiting has also been up. They've landed the highest ranked recruits since I want to say Anto Saka was probably the last 4-star that
Mhm.
Northwestern got. I
Yeah,
might be wrong on that,
that sounds right to me, but
depending on where
yeah,
you
I'm not 100%.
classify Nigel Glover and going to Ohio State and then back to Northwestern eventually.
Mhm.
But still, I'm inclined to believe that he knows what he's doing. And I think next year is the really big litmus test. If they end up ending the year on a 5-game win streak, 5-game losing streak, go from 5-2 to 5-7. I think obviously that's worth telling. But if it's every single game is a close game and it's not like this team quits, which it doesn't seem like it is, it seems like this is a team
Mhm.
that's really committed and motivated and rallies around him and that coaching staff. I'm inclined to believe that the program is still in a good place.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think as I've said many times, like I don't always trust what Braun is doing on the field, but behind the scenes in practice, all of the other times, I trust him fully. I mean, I think he does a great job with these players, and he always seems to have them playing for him. As we discussed on a previous pod, one of the major things that we've noticed in the Braun era is that he just wins the games he's supposed to win, which has also been a cool thing. And you could argue that Northwestern should win this Minnesota game, even though their record might be a game behind. You could argue that they should be favorites in this game and they should win. So maybe we'll see some more of that. One question that I have actually been meaning to ask you is just thinking ahead on the Minnesota thing this weekend. What was the crowd scenario in Wrigley against Michigan? Was it truly like 80% Michigan fans, as some people maybe predicted, or was it closer to 50-50 when Northwestern was surging at the end there? Was it loud? Like
Oh no,
I'm trying to figure out what.
it was definitely like 80 to 85% Michigan fans, but also like Michigan is one of the biggest or Chicago Michigan is one of the biggest schools that has an alumni hub in Chicago. I mean, like, for all
Mhm.
the
Yeah.
I love going on for the Northwestern and Chicago's Big Ten team thing, but if you're going in terms of just how many alumni and how many fans are in the city, I would say probably Notre Dame 1, Michigan 2,
Hmm.
Wisconsin 3, either Wisconsin 3 or Illinois
Illinois.
4. I'd
Yeah,
say
and like
Illinois
Ohio
probably
State
3 and
maybe.
Wisconsin 4, Ohio State 5.
Yeah. Hmm.
Northwestern is still buried down that list. So I do think
Yes.
I do think that having the bigger stadium or the smaller stadium next year is going to be a lot better for Northwestern's home field
Hmm.
advantage. But it got quiet. I will say that right after I want to say the second turnover in the fourth quarter where Northwestern takes the lead, it was quiet. And credit to the
Hmm.
Northwestern fans that did show up. The student section was pretty loud during those moments. The parents as well in their section were loud as well. I do think that Minnesota, it's going to be a much better Northwestern
Yeah.
advantage. I'm not going to say that, Northwestern's even going to be above 50%. We even saw,
Hmm.
I believe, 2 years ago when Northwestern had that massive comeback against Minnesota with Ben Bryant. The stadium still
Hmm.
had a lot of Minnesota fans in it, and that was at Ryan Field.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know. We'll see. That was also earlier in the season. Minnesota had a little bit more hope then. This Minnesota team
Hmm.
has already clinched a bowl game. It's going to be cold after it being warm last weekend. We'll see. I don't know if Northwestern's going to have the majority of fans at Wrigley Field this Saturday, but I do think it's going to be a lot closer.
Yeah.
On that note, just before we wrap up real quick, I wanted to ask you your predictions for the game this Saturday. I believe Northwestern is actually favored by just over a field goal in this game, despite Minnesota being 6-4, Northwestern 5-5. I think that's fair. Minnesota has long been my pick for where Northwestern's sixth win is going to come from. If you had to give a score and kind of what you think will happen during the game, where would you go?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we had that conversation about where they were going to get the sixth win, I think we both agreed that this was probably the one. And, obviously they've had this string of losses, but none of them have convinced me that they can't win this game. I think my opinion hasn't really shifted. I still think this is where they get their sixth win. So I'm taking Northwestern. Um, as far as the score, I think it'll be close. I think probably I'd go something around, 21-17, maybe. I think Northwestern's defense continues to play well, especially after last week, but probably doesn't, have force five turnovers again. That might not be sustainable week to week. But I do think that they get back to their game and they run the football well. Minnesota, I believe, is pretty middle of the pack in the conference, run defense wise, and um, do not run the ball well themselves. So, I expect it to look more like a typical Northwestern game that we've seen this season, where they come out on top.
I am also going to go with a win for Northwestern. I believe first time I picked a Northwestern win since Purdue. So hopefully it ends up on that end for the Wildcats. I'm going to go with 23-21 Northwestern. Like you mentioned, I honestly wouldn't be surprised if Northwestern was just angry and just jumped out of the gates
Hmm.
and it's like a 21-3 game or something like that. But as we mentioned, the Wildcats have had some trouble playing with the lead. And I think if they can really key in on Caleb Komalafe and Joseph Hyman and say, we know that with a 10-point lead or a 15-point lead or whatever, Preston Stone's probably not going to be throwing the ball. I think I think the Gophers can probably find their way back into this one. We'll see what happens. I'm going to give it to them. I'm going to give it to Northwestern and say narrowly. I guess they wouldn't cover in this instance. I want to say they're favored by 3.5 points. Any bold predictions? Any final thoughts about that game? About what we've seen from Northwestern, and your thoughts heading into the penultimate weekend of the regular season?
Um, yeah, I'll give you a hot take. Actually, I think if they win this game, um, yeah, I think if they outperform our expectations, okay, so we both think they're going to win, but there's some chances you mentioned that they come out angry and they just blow the doors off of Minnesota, and I think that's possible. I mean, it's unlikely, but it's possible. If they win this game going away, I think they beat Illinois.
Ooh, spicy. I was thinking about that
Yeah.
earlier today. I was like, you know what? They were 5-5 2 years ago, or they might have been 4-5
It might have,
2 years ago.
yeah.
Whatever it was, they went on that big win streak and finished the regular season 7-5. I mean, Illinois, their record wasn't quite as great as it was last year or this year that season, but they were still quality. And Northwestern put up, I want to say, 45 points in that game,
Hmm.
something like that. So you know,
Well, yeah.
Northwestern could still reach 8-5 at this point. As crazy as it is, as unoptimistic as the offense has seemed the last couple of weeks, it's not that outlandish. I'm not fully gonna agree with you, but I'm interested to see. I'm interested to see if it happens.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to talk about anger, I'm sure they're pretty mad about how last year's game went for the Hat. So that's sort of part of my reasoning is just I think they're going to come into that one firing, and it kind of ties into my faith in this Braun attitude that we've talked about, where it just seems like he's got him ready to go and he's got him playing hard all the time, and I kind of think if they build some momentum. Obviously, right now they're on this losing streak and everything doesn't feel great. But I think if they get a big win this week, then that makes the Illinois game a little more interesting to me. Looking forward.
Certainly. Ryan, thanks so much for coming on today. Anything you want to plug? Where can listeners and viewers find you?
Yeah, no, just I'm writing on our website, so you can check me out there or on Twitter, RTColo4 or Fs.
Awesome.
Sorry.
Whatever you want to call it.
Right. Yeah.
But thanks for hopping on, Ryan. I believe you and I will both be at the game this Saturday,
Hmm.
which should be exciting. First time in a while with Northwestern having all those road games and
Hmm.
whatnot. But should be exciting. As always, you can find all of our content at NorthwesternRoundtable.com. That's right. We have a fancy new link, a fancy new name. You don't have to type out the full thing anymore. You can just find it at NorthwesternRoundtable.com. Join the community, make your own post, share your thoughts with fellow Wildcat fans, read our coverage from the game, from the press conferences of Northwestern football, men's basketball, and women's basketball. You can also find more episodes of the Northwestern Roundtable podcast on YouTube and on Spotify. Northwestern Roundtable on YouTube. We also have something exciting coming up. Our video guy, Ethan Gomberg, was at the Wrigley game as well. He put together a great sights and sounds video from the Northwestern Michigan game. I'm sure a lot of Northwestern fans probably don't want to relive that too much, but really some great work overall. Lots of shots of the crowd and on the sideline, and just a really cool environment at Wrigley Field in what might be one of Northwestern's last games there. Thank you guys so much for joining, and as always, go Cats.